Good morning, everyone. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be at this conference. And as was mentioned, I've been with ERF since time T-1, actually, in some ways. And it's a thrill to be back with friends who are older and wiser, and meet new ones as well, and to see the evolution of ERF, which I was last associated with in this very room 5 years ago, in fact, at your 20th anniversary conference. What I thought I'd do, based on some of the work I've been doing in the last 5 years or so, and some of the work that my organization, CG, has been doing, is talk a bit about what has come to be known as the Intangibles Economy. Sometimes it's referred to as the new economy, digital. Now, these are not terms that are interchangeable, but in terms of the broad concept, I hope to convince you that in the broad outlines of what it implies for policy and for research, that there is something going on here globally, including, therefore, the ERF region. And in so doing, I hope that I can also do two things, which in fact, one that Ibrahim asked me to do, and I'm happy to, which is to flag for you what I think are areas of research and for policy interest that emerge from this new wave of thinking around the subject. And second, I hope, is to demonstrate by the end, not that you all need convincing, but to demonstrate why we need an ERF. That if it weren't for an ERF, the region would be poorer in every way in terms of its analysis and comprehension of what development and growth is. And I'll do this in three parts. I'll spend a bit of time just describing what we mean by intangibles. Then the bulk of my talk will be about what I think are the policy and research dimensions that emerge from the growth of the intangibles economy. And then at the very end, and for much less time, because this is simply not my area of expertise, I will try and connect some of this to what it might mean for the ERF region, and in so doing, convince you that there's something going on here. I begin, and by the way, the other thing I'd say that I hope I convince you is that although everything is new at one level, nothing is new at the other. I don't believe that we don't have the tools to analyze these issues. In some of these cases, you will see it's a plus ça change, back to the future kind of situation. These are all issues we've grappled it with historically in the last 40 or 50 years as economists. We might have forgotten some of these lessons, and I might convince you that it's time to bring them back, starting with, as I said, the title of my talk, Industrial Policy. But I'd begin with the framework that we're all familiar with, which is the standard Kuznets-Chenery-Sirkin framework, which says that over time, development and growth is characterized by three broad trends. One is that the share of agriculture declines in the economy. The second is that the share of manufacturing and industry grows over time. And the third is that the share of services also grows, and in most cases faster. And this particular slide is from South Asia, but as a stylized fact, it is something that we are familiar with for many regions of the world. In fact, I'd argue all of them. Now, underlying this, while this has been going on, we see a second trend, and that is that there is a growth in intangibles which looks slightly different, or at least the taxonomy is slightly different. And it's what you see here. And this taxonomy I've taken from a recent book that I think came out last year by Haskell and Westlake, which in many ways summarizes the subject well. Capitalism without capital is what they call their book, and it's all about intangibles. But effectively, what it says is, and I'm losing my sight already, is that there are three facets to intangibles. One is the one that we most associated with intangibles, which is software, databases, computer programs, and things like that, all of which embody value, they create value, they have value, but we don't necessarily see them. The second has to do with a set of more macro features, of which the most important tends to be land surveys and the information that embodies, for example, for extraction or mining or other kinds of seabed firms. And then the third, which is more firm-specific, has to do with, in some senses, firm organization and labor productivity. It's what you inculcate in your workers. It's brand development. It's iconic development. And how you create your internal firm in a way to minimize the costs and frictions of the production process. And so that, in some ways, is what the intangibles economy is. Now, one of the issues here is that there is not consistent data or even agreement on the definitions of what intangibles are. This is only one of 2 or 3 taxonomies out there. And so just as we did with national income accounts several decades ago, a huge global public good contribution by someone, some organization, would be to create a standardized set of time series data on intangibles that goes across many countries, because right now most of the information we have tends to be for a very small group of countries. And so to give you an example or an indication of what the intangibles economy looks like, 20, 30 years ago, the S&P index, intangibles of the firms listed on it comprised maybe 1/6 of the value of the index. A few years ago, it is 5/6. So tangibles and intangibles have effectively traded places in the matter of 2 decades in a major strata of the US. Another couple of slides on this. If we look at the data for the EU and for the US, so effectively 12 large countries in the world, what you find is that investment, the share of intangibles investment in GDP is now larger than the share of investment in tangibles. And that crossover took place around 2008. Another quick look at what this means. What we find if we now add 4 or 5 low-middle income countries from the EU. This is data from the European Investment Bank. So if you look at Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, and Slovakia as indicators of that brand, what you find is that investment in intangibles is roughly the same as in richer countries. But in the poorer countries, investment in tangibles is still higher. So that's the yellow bar that you see at the end there. If we then look at what intangibles look like across the taxonomy that I showed you before, the 3 dimensions of intangibles, what we find is that intangibles rank higher in the latter 2 and are slightly lower when it comes to software development. But at the end of the day, that relationship between the 3 is not that much different across this admittedly narrow group of countries. And the final indication I'd leave you of what the dimensions of the intangibles economy might be is to suggest to you that intangibles exist throughout the conventional 3 sectors that we're looking at: agriculture, industry, and services. But they're less evident in agriculture and much more evident in industry and services. And this too is common across the range of incomes that of countries that this particular chart looks at. So then the question is, what does this all mean for policy? And so what are the generals of tendencies that we can derive from the intangibles economy? Now, some of this spills over into what are digital firms, but in my view, there's 4 or 5 things that characterize this world. The first is, and just think of all the high-tech firms around you and the churn in them in the last 20 years. There's high upfront costs and high risk. Only a few firms survive. And the ones that do then have it made. They have it made because they derive their income from rent, the rent that accrues to them from holding intellectual property. And they have it made because once you've got this technique in place, the marginal costs of production are practically zero. An implication of this is that there is some first mover advantage, and that's especially the case if the first mover then gets to create the industry standard. Standards play a huge game in this world. And the classic example of standards actually has nothing to do with the high-tech economy, but it's an interesting one. In the late 50s, there was a sense that for trade and transport to be made more efficient, we should create a standard for containers. And so the then ISO created 3 standards, one for the US, one for Western Europe, and one for Eastern Europe. The point being that if you ship all your goods in a container that's standardized, then loading, unloading, transport, storage, all of that becomes much easier. And so you went from a multitude of container sizes to just 3. And a few years after that, because of the dominance of the US market, effectively today we have only one standard, and that's the US container size, that in many ways has been argued to have fueled globalization more than any other single facet, the fact that you could standardize transport and logistics in that way. Now think of how that works with digital technology. The way your cell phone logs into the Wi-Fi network at AFSET, and the fact that when you're at the airport, you don't need to do anything different. There's some switching standard that has been created, that someone's created and making a lot of money from without incurring additional marginal costs in any way. And so the other feature of this kind of economy is what we used to call and still do economies of agglomeration. And last and not least, and this in some ways I think explains what we're seeing currently in the US-China discussions, is that strategic behavior is hugely rewarded. Strategic behavior is rewarded in 2 ways. First, you need lots of upfront capital, patient capital, long-term thinking. And second, you need to be able to prevail, and prevail in ways that make you eliminate your rivals, because a lot of this is a natural monopoly through standards. And so there's only a few firms or few kinds of economic systems, perhaps, that are going to get us there. And as I said, in some ways, I think the US-China discussions have to do with 2 countries that understand geostrategy and understand the links between the economic performance of firms and global, in some ways, dominance. Policy responses. I've divided my thinking into 3. One I'd call a set of, broadly speaking, microeconomic responses. Second, a set of macroeconomic implications. And third, what it might mean for social policy. And in no order of importance, I'd say, so if you're now in a world in which IP matters, and in which strategic behavior matters, in some cases size now matters, then one thing that then you're back to an infant industry kind of world in which you want to nurture firms that may not be profitable today, but will be profitable in some social sense 10, 20 years down the road. And so there's room, as has been done in many countries, for using public procurement processes when you build your digital backbone to, in some ways, in a WTO compatible way, favor small and medium enterprises that are local in the hope that they will become bigger and create markets elsewhere. There's room for what's called patent collectives, or patent pools, as they used to be called. In the old days, what patent pools were simply an agreement between 2 or more firms that they would use each other's patents and freely license them without getting into debilitating lawsuits and friction to do with who infringed on whose patent. There's some evidence that this has been used, for example, in France and South Korea at the national level. It can also be used at a sectoral level. Canada has just begun this month a pilot program, not so much on patent pools, because that's a very narrow field, but something called patent collectives, which is the phrase I use here. Patent collectives say, if you individually hold 3 or 5 or however many patents, you're on your own. But if all the patent holders in a sector or in a country pool their risk, then when you have infringement lawsuits, it's like the insurance principle. You fight that lawsuit together, especially when we know that we live in a world of lots of vexatious lawsuits when it comes to IP and a lot of patent trolling, as it is called. So patent collectives are a way to protect patent owners before the patents have become commercially valuable. That leads more broadly into a wider question, which is, how do you generate IP? And here I think the development world has something to reflect on and a lot to offer. One of the, in my view, unsung stories in development cooperation is the International Agricultural Research System, which in fact many of and more organizations that created the ERF many decades earlier had created what's called the CGIAR. And what the CGIAR is a global collective of basic and applied research on different aspects of agriculture and agricultural policy. The patents are held in the public interest, they're not proprietary, and they have, in many parts of the world, eliminated, if not malnutrition, certainly abject hunger. Agricultural productivity has gone on, has increased for very small amounts of public investment in the creation of a public good. There's other ways to think of IP generation, the so-called Prize X model, the so-called Grand Challenges model. There's no reason why we cannot create IP that's in the public interest, but I should say that currently the trend is for IP to be hugely proprietary, in which most developing countries are on the outside looking in. And the final point I'd make, and this again is something we found when we did our work in Canada, is that there's a lot of IP that is locked up in universities. And universities, as you all might agree with me, are not the best places to exploit commercially a process or a patent. And so in Canada, we found that there's a ton of patents that universities hold and have not maximized their licensing fees from. Or individual researchers get grants, typically from foreign entities, to do work, sign off their IP to the foreign entity, and publicly funded universities in a rich country like Canada, but where they're languishing in funding, do not gain from any of the resulting commercial. So to be smarter about how we fund IP and how we share revenues from it is, I think, an important implication both for university administration, but for national policy more broadly. My second set of thoughts has to do with what this might mean for macroeconomic and trade policy. And I'd begin with the exchange rate. Why? So, once you're in a world where stocks, not flows, matter, okay, IP is a stock, intangibles are stocks, then you're back in a rentier economy, you're back in a land-based economy. How does the exchange rate work? The way the exchange rate typically works in its equilibrating function is to say that if you have a balance of payments deficit, and if you either depreciate or devalue, you make exports cheaper, you make imports more expensive. That creates, assuming the J-curve and Marshall Lerner, all of that is taken care of, over time, that is what equilibrates your payments. Now, if you're mainly in a world of stocks, then the exchange rate depreciation in this case doesn't quite have the same effect. Effectively, what you're doing is you're making your stocks cheaper for foreigners to acquire when you depreciate. Again, in Canada, this is an issue because our startups get bought up where every time the Canadian dollar depreciates, and what we're selling off are the crown jewels, because many of these firms will be the national firms of the future. Now, keep in mind that here you have a distribution and a political economy problem. On the one hand, you have the high-tech sector, which will say, manage the exchange rate, don't let it depreciate, but in most countries, you still have a manufacturing sector that actually requires that kind of adjustment. And so my policy lesson isn't abandon the exchange rate as a tool. It's simply to say that keep in mind that we now have the second consideration. But more importantly, it means that foreign investment review, which is again something that has gone out of fashion in many countries, is back on the table. It is possible that whether it's for national security reasons or whether it's just for national development reasons, not every foreign acquisition should go through. And the example that comes to mind is actually a firm called DeepMind, which is the preeminent artificial intelligence firm based in the UK, which Google purchased in 2014, just before it became hugely effective, for something like £400 million. DeepMind has gone on to create a lot of the AI algorithms that now wow us. You know, they beat people in chess and Go and everything else. And the fact is, how much is that firm valuable to Google as opposed to having British owners? What if there had been some kind of forward-looking foreign investment review? Would Google sell this firm at any price today? And the answer is probably not. But it was sold for 400 million pounds just a few years ago. So foreign investment review. Monetary policy becomes more complicated in a world like this for a number of reasons. But the two main ones are that typically in this kind, as you know from your cell phones, typically the way improvements happen in this world is prices go down and or quality improves. And so the price signal is not a full reflection of the consumer satisfaction or the benefit to the economy of having a quicker, faster switch or a quicker, faster cell phone. At the same time, it is also the case that the high-tech sector tends not to borrow from banks. They tend to borrow from venture capital and sources of funding that are less sensitive to interest rate changes. And so the nature of central banking and the signals that central bankers use to calibrate their monetary policy changes as this side of the economy grows. And at some point, just as we did with assets some years ago, this will have to feature in the way monetary policy is set. And the last and not least point I'd make, especially when it comes to developing countries, is what we do about these global firms. So effectively, as I've said, and as you would know, we're creating natural monopolies. These are now, there's some discussion that might they be broken up. We're not there yet, but for now, these are natural monopolies. If they're natural monopolies, then we move away from the way taxation or public finance has been headed for several decades, which is to tax consumption, back to taxing corporate profits. Because corporate profits in this case are effectively rent, and that's where the wealth is. At the same time, we also know that a lot of these data firms are very adept at what we used to call 30 years ago transfer pricing, right? So you move your profits around internally and you do your internal pricing in a way that you minimize your tax burden. Amazon famously paid no tax the last 2 years on profits of $11 and $17 billion. And so the policy implication here is, and I don't think this can be done nationally, that the base erosion discussions that are happening at the OECD and at the G20 really need to take shape in a way that you don't have a race to the bottom in which some jurisdictions allow profits to flow through them. And I simply don't know, but I'd leave you with the question, how much tax do you think Amazon or Google or Facebook pays in the MENA region? I don't know, but I'm guessing it's a shockingly low number. But how much benefit do they get from all the data points and the data that they gather from users of these firms in this region? Probably high. So we need some kind of global discussion on how we deal with what are global natural monopolies without sort of killing the goose that's laying the golden egg, which is the fact that these firms are providing a service to consumers and to business. And my last point on set of points on social policy has to do mainly with robotics and AI, but not exclusively. But as a stylized fact, I'd say, and I know that there's some dispute about this, but with robots, effectively the lower ends of the value chain are being taken away. And so the dramatic statement here is that the route to development that has been available to us since the Industrial Revolution is no longer available to you. So if you're Ethiopia or Kazakhstan, or indeed Tunisia, specializing in low-end manufacturers to mop up a lot of low-wage, relatively unskilled labor, and then moving up the value chain might not be an option if the bottom 20 and increasingly 30, 40% of the value chain isn't available, as with 3D printing and AI, effectively jobs either migrate to the West again or migrate to robots. In that case, you're in a completely different world. It's not a world we're in yet, I understand that, but we're thinking ahead here, and we're saying, what does that mean? So in many countries, social safety nets we have to think about, and education and the provision of public goods. The example I always give is in my country, you get quite generous, actually, scholarships to go to school and to university, but after you're about 24, 25, they stop. Meanwhile, in a digital world, you're in a world of lifelong learning. So a simple change in which you get rid of the age limit on receiving public assistance for retraining or going to universities would make a big difference in reskilling the labor market. Other examples include savings. So we may now be in a world in which there's no such thing as lifetime employment. You're actually doing different jobs, and you will be in long periods of unemployment where you're using your savings. Most countries I know have upper limits on tax-free savings accounts. That's not the way to go. In fact, if savings are something you don't use for the very end of your life cycle, but throughout your lifetime, then you really don't want to be taxing savings beyond any level. And last and not least, looking ahead to some of the more futuristic, if wealth is being created and concentrated in a few large natural monopolies, then it's entirely likely that we will be in a world in which governments tax that wealth and provide services like transport, health, and education almost entirely free to populations, because there is no other sort of source. Wage income is not where it's at. There is wealth being created. It's a question of redistributing that wealth in a way that ensures social stability and maintains economic growth. And an extreme version of that, which we are seeing, is universal basic income. So I simply mentioned that. To end then, let me just take a stab at what all of this might mean for this region, recognizing that I'm not at all the expert. A couple of indications of where the region stands when it comes to the so-called knowledge economy or the IP-based economy. If you look simply at the raw number of patents that countries in the region apply for, what you find is that with the exception of one or two countries, here and there, Iran and Saudi Arabia, most of the region has minimal numbers of patents. And so if this is an indication of anything, and I simply recognize again that these are only numbers and that there's a lot of context around that. In fact, yesterday in one of the breakout sessions, there's a very interesting ERF fellow doing a paper on exactly what the developmental value of Iran's patents and citations might be. So, bear in mind that numbers are only that. But that said, that's one indication. If we then look at patents on a per capita basis, what you find is that one or two countries from the region sneak in at the very end. But again, the region is at the middle to bottom end of the global rankings. I'd look then at what is it that you need to generate the knowledge economy. I'd look at one or two things. I might look at the level of connectivity in the region. I might look at R&D expenditures as rough indicators. So if I look at connectivity, what I find is in the global rankings, some countries start at about rank 38 and decline from there, so not particularly promising. We'll come back to that in a second. If I look at R&D, again, what I find is that it's not so much the proportional expenditure of GDP. R&D is one of those things where absolute size matters too. Like, if you're Liechtenstein and you say, I'm spending 60% on R&D, well, that's still not a large number. And so what you find is that the region starts around 17 with globally with Turkey, and then for the countries that are ranked, it's down to about 84. So again, middle to low levels. Now, the World Intellectual Property Organization has created an index, and again, like any index, this is a function of the arguments in it and the weights we give to it. But the WIPO Global Innovation Index looks at a number of features of inputs, R&D, connectivity, economic effectiveness of government policy. And what you find, again, is, by the way, Israel sneaks in at number 11, just after Ireland. But after that, where the MENA countries that are ranked are what you see there, between 38 and 126. And the last set of indicators I'd give you is the World Bank's governance index. Again, as saying, what are the think about what are the prerequisites that we need for a knowledge economy to emerge, for clusters and agglomeration to make a difference when it comes to technology and digital patents. So here what I do is I look at the MENA region vis-a-vis the rich OECD countries in 4 facets of governance. And I find that it's not looking particularly good. If I then compare the MENA region with East Asia, in which effectively this East Asia is a proxy for Korea, China, and Japan, the numbers look a lot better. And so that goes to a point that we also heard yesterday, I think, in the morning session, which is that when you look at successful countries, whether it's China, Estonia, Korea, Israel, in fact, Rwanda was mentioned, these are not countries that started off at a great spot. So the fact that you are somewhere that might not be good is not necessarily an indicator to say you will therefore never excel in this area. There's a series of ingredients that need to come together. They need to be investigated. They are country specific, they are sector specific, and it is that evidence that we need to get to that next stage and create that next level of development policy. And going back to those discussions I had with colleagues at the World Bank, UNDP, and Ford Foundation back when I worked at IDRC, when the ERF was created, it was exactly that ethos. That was the era in which, and that's how the AERC, by the way, was created as well, is a lot of the work was being done elsewhere. It was being done in Washington, it was being done in Paris, it was being done in London, but the region didn't have the wherewithal. Around the time that the ERF was created, and Heba would remember this, the bank had issued the East Asian Miracle, a very controversial document that kind of made the point that East Asia had succeeded not because it didn't adhere to the Washington Consensus, but in spite of not having adhering to the Washington Consensus. Perhaps a valid thesis, but a controversial one because it was being done from outside, and there was no sense in Asia itself of how to respond to this. And Africa and the MENA region had been through a series of these. And we now have a case in which I think the next generation of development thinking and policy can absolutely be informed by local priorities and local capacities. And for that, we have a lot to thank all of you and for ERF as well. So thank you very much.